Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Tom Winnifrith in my capacity as Chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Tom, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me.
Pleasure.
As you know, the conversation is being video recorded. The video recording will be placed on the APPG's website and will raise awareness of it through social media and so on. And as you're aware, you're carrying out this conversation with me as part of the All-Party Parliamentary Group's call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. So let's get things moving. Question number one for you, please, Tom. Could I invite you, please, first of all, just briefly, to tell us about yourself and outline, to begin with, how you came to interact with the Financial Conduct Authority. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm an investigative journalist. My speciality is exposing fraud, generally amongst listed companies, but I've also dealt with mini bonds, boiler room scams, and in the fund management community, I did a lot of work on Neil Woodford, first warning people not to put their money in him in 2015, and doing 1,000 articles, podcasts, video talks on him up until about 2018, 2019 when he collapsed. And when, for instance, the BBC Panorama programme did a Woodford special, they came up to my house here in Wales and interviewed me and my cats a couple of times, giving me credit for being the first person to expose Woodford and for the detailed work we did on him. I've been commended for my work numerous times by the Financial Reporting Council over some quite big frauds, the biggest one being Quindel, 3 billion fraud, and also commended by the FCA actually for bringing things to their notice, but far less. My first interaction with the FCA was actually under its former name, the FSA. At some stage in the 2000s, it renamed itself, but essentially it's the same organization. It had the same people and the same culture of being completely useless. And my first major interaction was about 2004. I was investigating two companies which were listed, one on AIM and one on what is now the Aquis market, but run by the same cabal of crooks. One was called 3DM, and one was called Eden Research. 3DM finally went bust, running out of other people's money in 2016. It had sent £65 million to money heaven. Eden Research hasn't gone bust yet, but after more than 20 years in business, it has only once ever reported a half-year profit, and that was the result of an accounting fraud, and it has, which the FRC has accepted was a fraud when I complained, and it has sent 35 million to money heaven. What happened back in 2004-05 was telling about the culture of the FSA and still the FCA today. Is I was engaged in writing dozens, hundreds of articles about 3DM, along with a number of colleagues, and they responded with pretty threatening, menacing lawyers' letters saying they were going to sue us for libel. And eventually we were called into the FCA, for the FSA as was, and they said, here's the deal. Mr. Winnifrith's not going to write any more articles about you, and you're going to drop all the lawyers' letter threats against him. And you don't argue with the regulator, so I said, fine, okay, I'll go along with that. Within a couple of days, 3DM's PR people were briefing that the FSA had told me to stop writing. They didn't mention the other bit, and they said he'd stop writing, showing that we were in the clear and he was talking rubbish. In 2009, I think it was either, was it the FCA or FSA by that point, gave 3DM a public censure for lying to investors. And it then mentioned that, oh, by the way, in 2005, we gave them a private censure for lying to investors. And giving them a private censure, actually, the 3DM fraudsters were able to spin this as a triumph and get a lot more people to put more money into the company and to back rescue placings, because they thought that 3DM had been exonerated by the regulator and I'd been castigated, when in fact the regulator had just given them a private slap on the wrists. It was only after they finally gave the public censure, because they carried on lying. The company took the message, the FCA or FSA is going to do nothing about us, so we can carry on lying, and they did. But eventually the lying got so much that something had to happen. And once the company was forced to start telling the truth, it just went into a tailspin and the share price diminished to more or less nothing, and then it went bust. But it was a failure by the regulator there to stand up for someone who was exposing the truth and to cover up for people who were committing fraud. And I'm afraid my interactions with the FCA ever since then haven't been much more impressive.
Thank you. Could you elaborate a little further on what the interactions you've had with the FCA has been like, please, Tom? Okay,
I have reported a number of things to them over the years. I raised issues about Neil Woodford. The Neil Woodford, the collapse of his funds, the gating of his funds, that happened because there were just an avalanche of redemptions and it was unable to meet those redemptions. But the warning signs were there 2 or 3 years beforehand. Very clear warning signs. He was doing things which were very, very naughty. He would put a large amount of money into an unlisted company at a low valuation, and then he would put a tiny amount in at a much higher valuation and revalue his whole thing. So miraculously, he made money. But as he was the only person putting money in at the higher valuation, it was totally illusory. In the end, such companies run out of money and the valuations crash, but not before Mr. Woodford had banked huge fees. There were numerous other things, transfers between funds at the wrong rate, all sorts of things he was doing. And I alerted the FCA to them. They did nothing. They could have done something. They could have acted immediately and replaced him as investment manager. Indeed, there's a case for saying they shouldn't have allowed him to be a manager in the first place. When he was at his previous firm, Perpetual, the day after he left, Invesco, the day after he left, Invesco was slated for 30 different regulatory breaches and fined heavily. Those were all on Woodford funds. The FCA should have said, look, if you've been such a naughty boy, how on earth are we going to allow you to run your own business where there'll be no checks on you, as there were? But they didn't. They failed on that. So I pointed these things out. Nothing happened. There have been a couple of most appalling boiler rooms operating in the heart of the City of London, selling shares in completely worthless companies to investors by telling lies. And I have flagged these up to the FCA. The two companies, the main companies here, are called Atbox Media and One True View. These companies have between them raised almost £100 million from private investors, and all that money's gone. It's all disappeared. And they told investors things like, we're giving you a chance to invest now. Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, he's coming in on the next investment round, but we're letting you get in early at a lower price, which is an obvious lie. And of course, it's been shown to be a lie. And I flagged up years ago this to the FCA, and they did nothing. They have easy ways to close down these boiler rooms, but they didn't. And so more and more money has been taken. And amazingly, these companies are still going. The same boiler rooms, the same people raising money for these sort of companies. I flagged up frauds. There's in the smaller company world, you can either list your shares on something called the Alternative Investment Market, AIM, which is run by the LSE, but actually has its own regulatory team, AIM regulation. Now, they're pretty useless too, but they're not as useless as the FCA, which regulates what's called the standard list of the main market. And the standard list, the FCA must approve your prospectus, and the FCA is meant to monitor when companies tell untruths or deceive their investors. But time and time again, I have flagged up things to the FCA, and only once have they done something about it. Now, let me just give you a couple of examples. There is a company on the standard list which floated, it's called Supply at ME Capital. It floated with a £226 million market cap. And it did so on the basis of a claim that its balance sheet was worth £226 million. The FCA signed off on that prospectus, and the company listed on March 23rd, 2020. March 31st, 2020, auditors came in to review the company's balance sheet 8 days after a flotation with a prospectus signed off by the FCA, and found that in fact the balance sheet was worth £1 million. They'd exaggerated by £225 million. That got restated a bit later. Supplier to ME Capital continued in its vein, with the directors selling down basically their entire holding of shares. They owned most shares in the company, which remember was valued at one stage at 226 million, and they flogged all their shares by telling lies. So they would talk about their pipeline of business opportunities. By the way, here we are 18 months after the IPO, and revenue to date is zero, more or less zero. They talked about a pipeline of opportunities of billions of euro, and they were then forced to elaborate that actually within that pipeline were people who'd signed contracts but actually decided not to do business with them anyway. So they told them to go away, but they still included that in the pipeline. Or where they'd made a proposal, but no one had come back to them yet, but that was still included in the pipeline. It was pure fiction, and they were raising money. The directors were selling shares into this fiction. The directors said in September of last year that revenues for the year to 30th September 2020 would be 2.2 million in a trading statement, and that encouraged people. So the directors sold more shares into that. Actually, they then had to change the year end. In January of this year, they changed the year end in order to hide the fact that revenues for the period 30th September would in fact be nil. So they changed the year end. That was where they tripped up. Because they changed the year end, they had inadvertently breached a rule whereby they had to submit 3 sets of accounts, 2 sets of interims and 1 finals. I pointed that out to the FCA, and 3 days later, the FCA said, "Thank you very much, Mr. Winnifrith, you're right," and they suspended the shares. Great, they acted, although they ignored all the other frauds and lies all the way along, which I had alerted them to. Then the company published its accounts, and it published a set for the 6 months to June 30th, 2020. And that was on January the 29th of this year. I, on that very day, went to Mark Stewart, head of the Market Integrity Unit, and his colleagues within that division, saying, this company's boasted revenues of several £100,000, but under IFRS 15, it cannot have revenues of more than 0. These are bogus revenues, these are bogus interims. I urge you to keep the shares suspended and to force them to reissue the accounts. They did that, but then they let the shares go back. They did nothing about forcing the company to restate the accounts. So false numbers were in the market, and on the basis of that, the company issued a whole load more shares. The directors sold a whole load more shares. And in August of this year, the company admitted, by the way, we've restated our interims for the half year 2020. Revenues were in fact 0. This is because of IFRS 15. Exactly what I had told the FCA, and the FCA did nothing at all about. There's one other standard listed company which I've done a lot of work on. It's called Amuthi Healthcare. It's a South African company, and the application for this company to list was signed by a lady called Connie Vriet. If the FCA had done a Google search, they would have discovered that Connie Vriet didn't exist. The reason that Connie Vriet didn't exist was that the real lady who signed it was called Connie van Newkirk, and she was a woman who had numerous convictions for fraud. She was behind Amuthi Healthcare. The FCA didn't bother doing a search. Now, if you go and try and open a bank account, or if you try and take some money out of the post office, they'll do a money laundering search on you. But the FCA didn't do this, and so the fraudster queen from South Africa was able to float the company. The company shares were, after about 10 days, suspended after the accountants, PKF Littlejohn, said, our name was on the most recent financials. We didn't give the company permission to use them. We'd resigned. They weren't the only people who resigned. Memory Crystal, the lawyers, had resigned because they were unhappy. They had discovered who Connie was. And so all these things, the FCA suspended the shares, but then they allowed them to be unsuspended. So there was another period of trading. during which time Connie and the CEO, Gert Wilhelm, were selling shares off market to people in South Africa, and a few people were selling shares on the market in London. The shares have since been suspended, and as it happens, Gert Wilhelm has been arrested, Connie van Niekerk has been arrested, the finance director has resigned and is, I believe, turning Queen's evidence in South Africa, and the only British director has resigned and reported the company to the Serious Fraud Office. But it's still listed on the standard list regulated by the FCA. Now, I don't expect its shares will ever retrade again, but there is an issue here that the FCA was more negligent in terms of money laundering than the bloke who runs your local post office. That's not very good, is it? And I'm afraid that Amuthi and Supply at ME Capital are just are one of many companies where there have been clear wrongdoings on the FCA's watch. Let me just give you one more. That's a company called Wildcat Petroleum. It listed on 30th December on the standard list, 30th December last year. And it said it had raised £600,000. In April of this year, the interim numbers came out for the 6 months to December 31st, and they showed cash nil, sums owing 600,000. What happened was that the people who'd ponied up for the IPO didn't give them the money in advance. They were given their shares. The shares were pumped with a whole load of fake spoofery about getting into Bitcoin, and they sold their shares at huge profit, and then they paid the company. The company lied in its first statement. The FCA didn't bother that the money was in the account when it signed off on the prospectus. The company had minus net current assets when it actually listed. And has anything happened about Wildcat? Of course not. I've complained to the FCA, but nothing at all has happened. I could go on. There are so many examples of this sort of skullduggery. The FCA as regulator is just not fit for purpose.
Thank you. In broad terms, and obviously you've touched on some of this already, Tom, in broad terms, what have your dealings with the FCA been like?
On the odd occasion, they appear to take you seriously. And on the odd occasion, you see them act. Now, it may be that behind the scenes, they are acting a little bit more than we think. And you just think, and I understand that they can't sort of make things public. But on more or less every occasion, you see clear scandals. I didn't mention the mini bonds. I flagged up London Capital Finance, everyone knows about. But I flagged up, I think, 6 high-profile mini bonds. And now all 6 have seen people lose vast amounts of money. And I was flagging them up. The FCA belatedly, in a couple of cases, stopped these people taking money before they went bust. In other cases, they just went bust. But these companies were being allowed to take money after I'd written articles, which the FCA has seen, showing that they were insolvent or that they were engaged in skullduggery or both. My instinct is that the FCA largely does nothing. It's very good about issuing, papers about how the city's got to respond to the climate change crisis, or how we have to deal with the gender pay gap in the fund management industry. No, I don't give a damn whether women in fund management, most of them are earning 6-figure sums. If they earn a little bit less than men, they're still very rich. I care rather more about the widows and orphans who are buying stocks in penny shares or in boiler room scams through high pressure salesmen who were buying mini bonds. Most of mini bond victims were women and were financially unsophisticated. Those are the women we should be fighting for, not a fund manager who's earning 150,000 quid. The FCA just doesn't appear to care, or it doesn't know what it's doing. I don't know which it is.
Have you ever experienced, Tom, situations where interacting with the FCA has been helpful to either yourself or others? If so, could you perhaps give us an example or two?
That's not going to take long. I suppose the only time is Supply at ME Capital being suspended.
Thank you.
But being suspended and forced to produce those three sets of accounts, but it then didn't when it was pointed out that one of the accounts was clearly fraudulent, the FCA didn't do anything about it as it should have done. And I'm afraid, no, all too often, I report things to the FCA, and I know that something is going to end in tears. And at the end of it, we will see a transfer of wealth from poor people to rich villains. And I know that's going to happen. I include Neil Woodford in that category, by the way, because he made 100 million quid out of Woodford Investment Management, whereas most people lost a lot of money. I know that's going to happen. I do it just for my own, I do it in the hope that the FCA will do something, but in the expectation that at least I have something on record. And when I send a letter to the FCA, I publish it on shareprofits.com, the website I run, so that it's there for record. And then when something fails, you can turn around and say, hang on a second, this is this shows the FCA is useless. Now, I don't know whether anything's going to change. The first time I raised this with a politician was over the Quindell fraud, which was a company which at its peak was worth £3 billion, but was, as reports by the FRC and by PricewaterhouseCoopers have established, from top to bottom engaged in fraud. And I did well over 1,000 articles on Quindell. And it was a clear fraud. I raised it with the FCA, who did nothing. I then went to Sir George Young, who was the MP for the neighbouring seat to where Quindell had its headquarters. He was also, as it happened, my step uncle and my second cousin once removed, or something like that. So he was someone who knew me. And he said, just don't worry about it, Tom. The FCA know what they're doing. And at that stage, I also raised it with a Labour MP, Paul Farrelly, who was a former financial journalist. And he said, oh, why don't you take it to private eye? And at that stage, I realized that the political class just didn't get it. They didn't understand how hopeless the FCA was, because with Quindell, I was showing things. I was serving up detailed analysis. I have some background in numbers, detailed analysis of subsidiary accounts and full company accounts, showing that fraud had taken place, showing without any doubt. I was serving it up to them on a plate. And that analysis, by the way, is stuff that the Financial Reporting Council commended me for and saying how accurate it was. I served it up on a plate. I gave it to them and they did nothing.
Thank you again. What are your thoughts, Tom, on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely, that it doesn't make good use of the powers it already has?
Okay. I think the analogy that I would use with the FCA on white-collar crime is that of crime in New York City. Back in the days when New York was a fun place to live, you used to get held up at gunpoint and people would get shot all over there. And it was a crime-ridden, it was like Gotham City, it was bad. And the way that they started to tackling it was by tackling the small crimes, adopting what might be termed a zero-tolerance approach. And that's what the FCA could do. It has the powers to tackle all of these things. It has both the powers and also the sort of threat. If you're running a broking firm and you're up to no good, Andy, I'm sure you'd never be in that position. But if you were running a broking firm and up to no good, and you're regulated by the FCA, what the FCA can do to you is it can either just close you down, or it can come in and say, I'll tell you what, Andy, we don't think you're doing a few things right. We can make your life a living hell with perpetual arrows investigations, and your life will be a hell and you'll never make any money. Or maybe you can do things a bit differently. And guess what? People do things a bit differently. So it has that power, but it also has explicit powers. So when we go back to things like, those boiler room things, the FCA can look at the documentation, which the boiler rooms behind Atbox Media and One True View, and there's a new one in the stable, Eden Farmer. You look at the documentation, what is sent out to marks, to prospective investors. And I've got it. I've got the letters and saying about, oh, Mark Zuckerberg's going to be investing next week. You can get in at a cheaper price. Well, that counts as a financial promotion. And the FCA has the power to say this financial promotion is misleading. pack of lies and to come down on people like a ton of bricks. So it's got that power. It could close these people down. When you come to companies telling lies, well, we've shown, I've demonstrated to the FCA, Wildcat Petroleum, Chill Brands is a standard listed company. There's so many lies. I wrote to the FCA about them just yesterday over the latest nonsense from them. It's very easy. If you are a quoted company and you tell a lie, the FCA can do anything to you. It can take away your listing. It can certainly prosecute the directors for market abuse. It has got all of the powers it needs. It just doesn't use them.
Have you experienced the FCA being reluctant to give clear answers to questions?
I understand why it doesn't. I'm a journalist. Obviously, journalists are untrustworthy fellows. So even if I say this is off the record, I can understand they may say, "You're telling a journalist a secret. It's like putting up a billboard at Piccadilly Circus." So I understand. And if you're dealing with what is financial crime, it is quite right that they don't give answers, because you have to assume that someone is innocent until proven guilty. Now, all these people I've been talking about, they're guilty as hell, but you have to give them the benefit of the doubt. And so I think it's quite right that the FCA doesn't give a running commentary on what is happening with its investigations. I'd support it in doing that. The problem is, I just don't think it's doing any investigations.
Next question, Tom. What is your perception of the culture at the FCA?
I think the culture at the FCA is one which reflects the zeitgeist of the day. The people at the top are men and women who went to the right universities, Oxford, Cambridge, a few Russell Group people in there just for diversity. And they come from a similar background and they have similar concerns. I don't think there is any understanding there of the sort of people who do tend to be victims of financial fraud. Most people who are victims of financial fraud are not sophisticated investors. You get the odd person, M&G invested in Quindell because its fund manager was in charge was a moron. You get the odd sophisticated investor who does that sort of thing. But generally, the people who invest in fraudulent companies, certainly in boiler room scams, they target the financially unsophisticated. And these are people who come from different social milieu to those people at the top of the FCA. They have different concerns. They're not really the sort of people who perhaps aren't, totally wetting their knickers about having a net carbon zero policy by 2030. They don't really care about whether female fund managers earn 1% less than male fund managers. They're more concerned with how the hell they're going to pay their rent or their mortgage at the end of the month. And I think the FCA is just drawn from a totally different social milieu. They don't understand the victims. Other thing is, I don't think they understand crime. The FCA, there is a senior person at the FCA who back in the black and white era was my girlfriend. She's a virtuous girl. She didn't deserve me at all. She's a very nice girl. And I'm glad she saw the light and moved on to better things. But she's exactly the sort of person who would get a senior job at the FCA because she wouldn't dream of parking on a double yellow line. And she has no idea of how someone who isn't like her thinks. So when we saw with Woodford was clearly breaking the rules, but he was doing so in a way which allowed him to tick all the boxes in the FCA questionnaire. Have you got under 10% of your fund in unquoted stocks? Woodford ticked the box. Now, actually, he did so by being very devious. He would, you were allowed to quote, say that a stock was quoted if it was set to IPO within a year. So what he did was he said this company is going to IPO within a year. When it didn't, he sold his shares and then he bought them back 30 days later and said this stock's going to IPO within a year. And by doing so, he keeps himself under the 10% limit. And there were various other ruses which he did as well. Now, but he was able to tick the FCA boxes. Now, my ex-girlfriend and all the other nice people at the FCA, they're lovely people, I'm sure, absolutely sweet. Sort of people you want to be godparents to your children. but they have no comprehension that someone could be that devious and naughty. And because they're all nice people, I think they don't really like interacting with the best fraudbusters. The best fraudbusters are people who might be sort of deemed somewhat aggressive or unpleasant. My greatest friend as a fraudbuster is in fact a former fraudster. He was a hero of the fraud community, Sam Antar of Crazy Eddie's in New York. These days, he's a fraudbuster. Why is he so good? Because he knows how criminals work, because he was one for 25 years. And he still thinks he's tempted. He could do it. But I cannot imagine a British regulator wanting to associate with Sam Antar. Over in America, they do. The SEC Sam will bust a fraud just for fun, and the FCC send him a nice big fat check. That's how the SEC interacts with people like Sam. The FCA, they wouldn't want to be seen in the same room as those sort of people. So the culture is one of sort of woke prudishness.
Have you ever complained officially about the FCA? If so, to whom?
No. I sent a letter to Wicked Uncle George, and I think after that I just gave up. The FCA did, on occasion of the supply at ME dodgy interims, which I pointed out were completely made up, and they overlooked that, and then the company admitted 6 months later, after the directors had dumped a whole load more shares, they were completely made up. On that occasion, I did complain to the FCA. I said, I think you've had a bit of a failing here. I pointed this out and you did nothing about it. And they said, well, if you want to complain about us, here is the mechanism about how you complain about it. But it's a bit like, the Metropolitan Police in the old days. You get beaten up. Who do you complain to? Oh, the Metropolitan Police. They're investigating themselves. It's pointless.
And what do you think about the possibility of conflicts of interest issues at the FCA?
In the world that I live in, I don't see that there is a conflict of interest. I understand that there is an idea that people will move from a big law firm through to the FCA, or a big accounting firm through to the FCA, and then the FCA has got to look at the way the big law firms and the big accountancy firms are up to no good. I understand there is a perception that's wrong. I don't actually think it is. I don't see that there is a conflict, a massive conflict there. You're always, if you're going to go around hiring, senior accountants and senior lawyers, these things are going to happen. I think there's a way around it. But to be fair to the FCA, I don't think that just because you used to work for KPMG, you're going to give them a particularly easy pass. I don't think that's the way they think. I just think they're so hopeless they couldn't catch KPMG in the first place.
Do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar to the spot checks by VAT inspectors?
Not unless they hire some people who are good at catching crooks, no. And I don't think spot checks are needed, because spot checks will waste the time and resources of good firms as well as bad firms. What the FCA needs to do is to say, well, here we have carte blanche evidence that a regulated firm has been naughty in certain respects, or that a listed firm has lied in certain respects. You know what? We're going to throw the book at them, and we're going to do so in a public way. So we will not only fine, hopefully, the individuals as well as the firm. Actually, fines don't work, because firms tend, as we see with the FRC and recent cases, accountancy firms who've done bad things. KPMG Silent Night is a recent case, which Prem Sekar raised in the House of Lords the other day. For KPMG, in the case of Silent Night, where it did something very, very naughty, it's just the fine was just another cost of doing business. For the individual partner who behaved despicably, his fine was paid for by KPMG, so it didn't cost him a cent. I don't think fines really work. What I would like to see is the FCA say that it's not companies that commit fraud, it's individuals. It's not companies that break the rule, it's individuals. And you give them the sanction of saying, you're not allowed to work in financial services anymore. Very simple. If you have committed an offence, And it really, you go back to, if not New York policing, you go back to Singapore, where they sort of throw you in prison for leaving some chewing gum on the pavement. You say you committed if you've deliberately committed an offence, even a relatively minor one, we're going to ban you from financial services. Minor one, 1 year ban. Serious one, 20-year ban. If you do that to individuals, not firms, individuals, and you do it publicly, then that will change the way that everybody else behaves. And that's the only way to deal with crime, is you do it publicly and severely against individuals and make sure everybody knows about it. And so, Andy, when your brokerage firm is looking at its compliance procedures, you will think, cripes, we're not going to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to be spending the next 20 years doing something else. And if you're a listed company, you will be forced by the FCA when you list to read a list of the individuals who've been told you cannot be a director of a listed company for the next 20 years. And this is what they did. And say, look, if you're tempted to be naughty, Andy, this is what will happen to you. Perhaps you should consider the path of virtue.
Thank you, Tom. And what positives are there about the FCA that you'd like to comment on?
None.
Next question.
I genuinely cannot think. I'm appalled that in the era when we've seen so many scandals in the FCA, in UK financial services, the FCA has paid out well over 100 million quid in bonuses to its staff. That's a reward for failure. Well, I hate to think what the bonuses would have been if they'd actually stopped Woodford or stopped the mini bonds. Would have been bankrupting. The amount they spend on staff parties, the amount they spend on sort of, non-customer facing functions. They should be there to stop crime and protect investors. But the amount they spend on PR and HR and ESG initiatives, it's just scandalous. So am I trying to think of anything good they've done? Yes, they've said they're going to cut back on bonuses. That's about the only good thing I can say about it.
Next question, Tom. If you could change 3 things about the FCA, what would they be?
We'd start with the entire senior management team. There are people there. There's one member of the FCA board who was singled out for criticism in the London and Capital Finance scandal for being so criminally useless. And her award was she got promoted. The FCA made a song and dance about it, saying, yeah, it just shows she's been promoted as a few other women. What a gender diverse board we've got. And you think, that's not what we as consumers of financial services care about. I don't care about the gender diversity on the board. I want you to stop some criminals stealing money. So the fact that she was promoted was bad enough, but the fact that the FCA as an organisation crowed about it shows to me that they haven't got a clue. So the senior management need to be changed. They need to bring in, frankly, some former criminals. I see Dominic Raab is encouraging companies around the country to start employing former inmates. Well, the FCA should take a lead. It should get in some former criminals who have some idea about how crime works. I joke, repentant criminals, should we say. But there needs to be a change of senior management. That's one thing. I think the FCA needs just to review what each of its people do. And anyone involved in something which is not to do with protecting consumers or catching crime should be fired, and the resource put into extra people to deal with protecting consumers and catching crime. And finally, those people who haven't been fired at the end of the process should be forced to read the rule book and make it their goal. And I'd be happy to see them given bonuses if they do it. Their goal to catch people for breaking the rules and kick them out of the industry. And they can. I'd happily see the FCA award loads of bonuses, but based solely on that, kicking people out of the industry. And that's not just, one financial advisor in Essex, which is what they sort of boast about. Rather more important criminals.
Your second to last question, Tom. The FCA is undertaking a transformation project. Do you have any comments to make about that?
Yeah, well, I'm old enough, and I suspect you're old enough too, that we remember when it was the FSA. And we've had a rebrand. The FSA, to great excitement, became the FCA, and it was the same people with a different logo doing the same job and doing it badly. And they say that they're having a rebrand. As the only thing that I can see is that they have given this commitment to cut back on the bonuses, but there is no commitment to stop rewarding failure with promotion if your face fits. And there seems to be no acceptance that the primary purpose is protecting consumers and stopping crime, and that doing papers about global warming or the impact of Brexit and how we're to get around it is just pointless. It's not their game. Anyone who's authored such a paper within the FCA should be first on the P45 list.
Your final question, Tom. Are there any other comments that you would like to make?
I think I've said enough, haven't I? I have said enough. I hope, my comment is that I know that you have a number of parliamentarians, including the great Prem Sikka on your board. I hope they take this on board, and I hope they understand that amongst private investors, for whom there aren't that many voices, amongst ordinary private investors, there is utter outrage at the failure of the FCA to protect them. And I'm a sort of libertarian, so I kind of think in many ways caveat emptor. But the problem with the FCA is it pretends that there is regulation. In my world, there'd be sort of no regulator, and you go in and you lose your money or you make your money. That's just a libertarian perspective. But the problem is that we have this pretense that Britain is a regulated place. But what it means is that regulation means that you do have to fill in 28 forms to prove you are who you are when you open a post office account, but that white collar crime in London is just rampant. And I wonder if the MPs and lords in your body appreciate just how angry private investors. You should see the emails I get from people who've been scammed here, there, and everywhere. The utter anger, but also the misery that this causes, because all too often it is, invariably it is financially unsophisticated people. I know that there are some people out there, people like my wife, good socialists, would say, oh, but it's only rich people who buy shares. It's not. It's all too often financially unsophisticated, not terribly wealthy people who need the money for their pension, paying off their mortgage, etc., etc. And it is those people who are ripped off, and it is those people that the FCA has failed.
Tom Winnifrith, thank you very much indeed for sharing with us your evidence for the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. Tom, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.